This lecture today is about passion, place, and people, or working as stewards of God's creation. What does it mean to work as a steward of God's creation? Let me start with a story. I am one of God's sheep. I work in God's pasture. I work as a steward of his creation. Computers, engineering, math, and teaching are some of the gifts the Good Shepherd gave me to steward his creation. The boundaries of my workspace were a gift the Good Shepherd gave me so I wouldn't wander off chasing squirrels. Although, to be honest, once in a while I get so focused on engineering, technology, or accounting, or teaching, that I follow them right out of the sheepfold. And then I soon found myself in the dark on the edges of a cliff. Sometimes I even fell down that cliff, until a tree sticking out the rock stopped my fall. When I did wander off, the Good Shepherd left the sheepfold and went looking for me, and he would carry me back on his shoulders. Looking back, I'm surprised he never tired of fetching this lost sheep. But something? There were other shepherds in the sheepfold as well. Some sang sweet siren songs. Others played tunes like the Pied Piper. But most of the time I ignored them and listened to my Good Shepherd's voice. But sometimes I foolishly was tempted to listen to their siren songs, or to follow the Pied Pipers dressed as shepherds. And when I did, the Good Shepherd would hear me plaintively bleating and crying when I ended up lost in rocks. And he would come and bring me back to the sheepfold. Yes, there were times when I was surrounded by wolves. Some even wore sheep's clothing, but I learned to trust my Good Shepherd to keep me safe. When I got bitten by the wolves of toxic workplaces or obnoxious inquisitors, or got tired of working around lazy, sleeping wolves, I just had to cry out, and the Good Shepherd came quickly and bandaged my wounds. Sometimes I was dumb, and at night, I'd sit there and I would pick at these wounds, and they would fester and fester. But every time I cried out to the Good Shepherd, in his great love and grace and mercy, he came and restored me to health. I used to not like getting wounded at work, and I still don't really like toxic work environments, but I don't mind them quite as much anymore, because with each wound, I get to know the Good Shepherd more. And when I learn something new about my trades, about my skills, when I use my skills in a new way, I'm also discovering something more about the Good Shepherd. Working with the Good Shepherd, as a steward of God's creation, I am constantly surprised by his mercy, his love, his healing, and his grace. And there are three aspects that I would suggest to working as a steward of God's creation. The first aspect is the passion. As I mentioned in the story, my passions are computers and engineering and teaching and working with numbers. Those are passions that God created me to be with. Those are passions that God gave me to be a wise steward of. The second part of working as a steward of God's creation is the place where I am working. I've worked in many different cities and in many different jobs. Each of those was a special place that God placed me in for a specific season of my life. And the third aspect of working as a steward of God's creation are the people who God has entrusted me with for this season. These are my coworkers. These could be customers. These could be suppliers. These are the men and women that God has entrusted to me for a season to work with and to serve through my job. And in my job, at the intersection of passion, place, and people, God asks me a question. God invites me to walk with him, to experience him, to encounter him, to encounter God as I use my passions, to encounter God in this place where God has placed me to work, and to encounter God through the people that God has surrounded me with in this workplace. That is my vocation. That is the choice God gives me. Will I walk with him or will I not? So let's take a moment and let's unpack each of these, passion, place, and people, a little bit more. First of all, the passion, the gifts that God has given me. I would suggest that each of our passions are gifts that God has given us. And each of these, and let me ask you a question. Would you rather have the gift of accounting, construction, or engineering? Or would you rather have a Tim Hortons gift card? Well, early in the morning, when I get up and have to go to work, that Tim Hortons gift card would be really nice to pick up a fresh cup of coffee. But in reality, if I'm honest, I would much rather have the gift of accounting, or the gift of engineering, or the gift of the performing arts, or the gift of biology. These are all gifts from God. But you know what's unique about these gifts? They're also a reflection of God's character. After all, who was the first accountant? God was the first accountant. He counts all the stars. He knows, and he has named every one of them and has put them in their place. He has counted each of the hairs on our heads. God was the first accountant. What about the first biologist? God was the first biologist, for he was the one who created the animals and the birds. What about the first farmer? Well, I think God was probably the first farmer. He was the one who created the world, planted the trees, created seeds, and planted them in the ground so that they would grow. What about the first engineer? Again, I would suggest God was the first engineer. The principles of gravity, the principles of electricity and electronics, the principles of civil engineering, of mechanical engineering. God had to use all of those principles to create this world. But what about the arts and the performing arts? Was God the first performing artist? I would suggest he was. Look at this, look at the beauty of creation. How can you not deny that there was an artistic creator in the way the world is created? So in all of these areas, God, who gave us these gifts, was the first one to practice these gifts. And as we practice these passions, as we pursue our passions, they help us understand God better, because we are understanding the God who practiced these first. But it's a reciprocal relationship. Not only as we practice these gifts do we get to understand God better, but we also get to enter into a deeper relationship with God. We have the privilege of saying, God, show me a better way to do this accounting, or to practice engineering, or show me a way to build this product, this desk, this piece of furniture, this cabinet, this building. And together, as we work on these gifts, these gifts, these skills are essential for fulfilling God's mission. These gifts that fuel our passions are good gifts. They're holy gifts. They're freely given. Don't ever let anybody tell you that the gift of a cabinet maker is less than the gift of an engineer, or that the gift or passion of performing arts, of being an artist, of painting, of making music, of drama is less than the gift of an accountant. No, these are equally valuable and precious gifts. And as we practice these gifts, we get to reflect God's character. But there's something else that I want to consider as we think of these gifts, as we think about these passions. What is it that brings them all together? Or what is it that drives them apart and causes people to say that engineering is the right way to go, and causes the competition between the engineers and the math people, or engineers and artists? I would suggest that it is faith that is the common thread that pulls all of these together. Faith is the common thread that pulls these together because each of these are a reflection of God's character. Faith, and when we work together, when the engineers and the accountants and the biologists and the artists and the educators and the theologians work together, this forms a beautiful symphony of love and praise to our Creator. As we working as a steward of God's creation, we don't work in isolation with our passions. We work together in a community of other people who each are stewarding their passions. And it is together as a community in faith that we steward God's creation. With faith, we're like the wise builder who built his house in the stone. There's a story, a parable that Jesus tells of a builder who built his house in the rock. And when the storms came, and the winds blew, and the rains came, his house stood firm. Faith is the bedrock that gives each of us in our career when the storms of life happen, when there are financial crises, when there are crises in the environment, when there are crises with coworkers. Faith is the bedrock that enables us to remain firm in our passion and to continue to do it with excellence. But I want to draw a distinction here for a moment between faith and religion. The difference is that religion is a practice that God gave us, just like he gave us biology and engineering, so that we can express our faith. But religion can also be a choice in an empty set of rituals. So how is faith at work shown? How do we work as a steward of God's creation, modeling faith? By using our passions? It's very simple. By doing the little things and the big things exceedingly well. Or in other words, by doing our work with excellence. So faith is what brings all of our passions together. What is it that drives them apart? I would suggest, through the eyes of rational thinking, we would say faith didn't give me any of these things. It is the lack of faith that drives these apart. It is rational thinking that drives these apart. It is pride that drives each of these passions apart. And the rational thinker legitimately can say and can argue, without having an iota of faith, that these are just the way, our passions are just the way we are created. But I would suggest to you that this question of faith is really a question of stewardship. Jesus tells a parable in Matthew 25:14-30 about three people. One of them, the master gave 5 bags of gold. The second person, the master gave 2 bags of gold. And the third person, the boss gave 1 bag of gold. Then the boss goes away for a long time. We're not told where the boss goes. Maybe he traveled to another country. Maybe he went on an extended vacation. But he finally returns and he visits the 3 employees to see what they've done with the bags of gold he gave them. The first person, who got 5 bags of gold, looks at the master and says, I took your 5 bags of gold. I worked hard, and look what I have. I now have 10 bags of gold. And the master says, or the boss says, well done, good and faithful employee. You've been faithful with a few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many things. Come and share your boss's happiness. The second employee comes up and shows him 4 bags of gold. Master, you gave me 2 bags of gold. I worked very hard, and I turned take these 2 bags of gold, and now we have 4 bags of gold. Now he was a little bit scared because the first employee had brought 5 bags and had brought 10 bags. But the master looked at him and said, well done, good and faithful servant. I gave you 2 bags of gold, and you've returned to me with 4 bags of gold. You've been faithful with a few things. I also will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then, with fear and trembling, the third employee showed up and is shaking hands, handed his boss the 1 bag of gold he'd been given before. The boss was furious. You dirty, rotten, lazy slob! You knew that I harvest where I haven't sown, that I gathered where I haven't scattered seed. You're a lazy slob. Why didn't you at least put this bag of gold in a bank account? Take this lazy slob, kick him out of my company. I never want to see him again. By burying his 1 talent, by not using this 1 bag of gold, by not embracing it as a gift, this lazy slob communicated to the world that the giver himself, that his boss was a hostile, cruel person. That's not who the boss was. Not at all. That's not who our God is. Our God is a kind, merciful God. And as this parable shows us, when we have 5 talents, the gifts, the gold that God has given us through these passions, if we use them to be a steward of his creation, God will reward us richly. But if we choose to reject these gifts, maybe we say, you know what, I really don't want to be an engineer, even though that's really what I'm good at. And I really want to go and become a hockey player, even though I could never hit a hockey puck if I tried. What are we really doing? I'm revealing a lack of gratitude to God I'm failing to acknowledge that my skill as an engineer was a gift from God. I'm failing to acknowledge that even my very own existence is a gift from God. And the Bible is a very simple way of describing that. The Bible calls that sin. Failure to acknowledge that these passions are a gift from God is being unfaithful to the fact that I and we were created by God. It is being unfaithful to the fact that God is the prime mover in history, not us. And you know what happens without faith? Education, accounting, construction, they all become tribes. And eventually people within this tribe will build a Tower of Babel, and they will start fighting with each other. My field is better than your field. But the other thing is, without faith, I would suggest that when we build our careers in these fields, we're building on sand. Without faith in a God who's given us these passions, what happens when the storms come? When the budget crisis happens? When the work we're working on doesn't work out the way we expect it to? When people mistreat us in the workplace? When we can't find a job, what happens? We have nowhere to turn. We don't have an anchor for our life. Faith that these passions came from God is the anchor that sustains us. So what about the next aspect? We've talked about passion. How do we steward the place? How do we work and steward the place where God has given us as a stewards of God's creation? Well, stewarding the place where God has given us, working as a steward of God's creation in the place where we are working, comes from recognizing that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Comes from recognizing that God is present in every workplace. That God is present at university, that God is present in the classroom, that God is present right now as you're watching this video. The place where I work, if I live by faith, my eyes are open to faith, I see myself working there as God's beloved. I see myself working in this place, bearing the image of God. This is the place where I work is where I enter into a dramatic relationship with God. A unity of body, soul, and spirit. And what happens in this place is an opportunity to get to know God. It's in this place where I work where I get to explore the mysteries of God. And as a precious diamond in this place, we get to reflect God's hope, God's joy, and God's grace. The place where we work is the place where faith is formed. Who knows? Maybe the place where God has placed you, maybe God has placed you in this particular place for such a time as this. Consider with me for a moment the story of Esther. Esther is a young lady whose story we find in the Old Testament. She during her time in the Old Testament, the king had a wife who was rude to him, snubbed him, and the king said, I want a new wife. And so the king had all the beautiful women who lived in the country brought into his harem. This was a time still when when a man could have multiple wives, and that was acceptable. And so this king has this harem, this, if you want to call and use modern day terms, this condominium complex where all these beautiful women lived. They were given the best, and there was a magnificent spa in this condominium building, if you want to use that example, where these women were given the most best of the spa treatments. Their fingernails were done, their hair was done, their faces were done, the lips were done. They practiced what it meant, how to walk as a beautiful young lady in a way that would be sexually appealing to the king. And eventually, after a year of training, after a year of beauty treatments, each woman would go before the king, and either the king would like her or the king wouldn't. Many of the women didn't make the cut. And yes, this was a cruel, horrible world in the way they treated women. I'm not advocating in for one moment that this is a good way for women to be treated. But one of these women was Esther, and the king liked her. And the king liked the way she walked, the way she held herself. The king liked her beauty. And so the king invited her to live with him in the palace. Now, there was something you need to know about Esther. Esther was from a different tribe than where the king was from. Esther was a Jew. Esther's tribe was not well respected. There was another guy working for the king, and he became jealous of Esther's tribe and Esther's people. And he decided that he was going to, and he went to the king and he wanted them wiped out. So he went to the king and said, "King, I've got a favor to ask of you." And the king said, "What's the favor?" "There are these people called the Jews who really annoy me. I'd like you to write an edict so that we can kill them all." And the king didn't think much of it. He didn't know that Esther was a Jew, his new wife, his new queen. He just said, "Yeah, tell you what, you can have one day. I don't want them all wiped out, but you can have one day where you can go and kill all the Jews, as many people as you can kill on that one day." This advisor to the king was quite happy with that. But then Esther heard about this. And Esther had a really close friend who said to her these words, "Who knows, God may have placed you here for such a time as this." And there's more to Esther's story, but Esther used her wisdom, her tact, and she was able to convince the king that what this advisor was doing was wrong. And in fact, the tables were turned. Instead of the Jews being killed, those who wanted the Jews killed, the Jews were given permission to slaughter those who wanted the Jews who were going to be killed on that day. You can find more of this story in the Bible in the book of Esther. So who knows why you are in this job, in this place, at this time? The only one who knows the answer to that question is God. But if by faith, if you are working as a steward of God's creation, if you are trusting God in this place where you work, God has you there for a reason. You may never know why, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that you continue to walk by faith in that role. And the third aspect of working as a steward of God's creation is trusting God that he's entrusted you with a group of people for this season. People. Do I really have to work with people? And then do I have to work with people who are different than me? People who dress differently, smell differently, talk differently, think differently? As one person said to me, "I'm exhausted. I'm frustrated with the leadership. But you know what? We're doing okay. We'll make it." You know, as one writer wrote, autonomy in the strict sense is simply impossible. For us to be independent of others and to be independent of God is to be cut off from all being, and thus to be nothing at all. To be left to our own devices, cut off from God, is to be lost in sin, which is a negation of being. Imagine if you were the only person on the world, on this whole planet, with no other people around. What's the purpose of your life? So sadly, autonomy is not an option. But look at this quote that a person wrote in the 17th century. "The contradictions of mortals, their inconstancy, their very injustice, will be seen to be the results of God's wisdom, justice, and unfailing goodness. We will see nothing but that infinitely good God hidden behind the weakness of blind, sinful humanity. The greatest persons are nothing of themselves, but God is great in them. He uses their caprices, their pride, their pretensions, their vanity, and other wild passions to set forward his everlasting purposes for his elect. He turns everything within and without, the sins of others and our own failings, to our sanctification." As people working as a steward of God's creation, God places us in a certain place amongst a set of people with the passions he's given us to be salt, flavoring the workplace, to be light, lighting the darkness of the place, to be yeast, permeating the department where we work. Now, the scripture is very clear that wheat and tares, wheat and weeds, will grow up side by side. But we also know that a well-watered field, if we really water our lawns well, and fertilize it well, it doesn't leave much room for weeds to grow. And so we who are Christians, amongst the people we live, have the opportunity to grow and to be a big tree, a canopy of grace, to protect them from some of the darkness that happens around the workplace. But as we think about being a steward of the people God has entrusted us to, who is our neighbor? The Bible says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and the second is to love your neighbors yourself. So in the world of work, in the world of business, who is our neighbor? Is the neighbor just the people in the 3-kilometer block around where our office is? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And from a business perspective, our neighbor might be the community where our office building is. But in the world of business, our neighbors include the investors, the men and women who provided the finances for us to do our business, the suppliers, the people who provide the products that we need to do our business, the creditors, the people who loan us money so that we can go and buy equipment, the government, who establishes rules and regulations for us to do our business, who sets boundaries, who provides policing and fire service for us. Our customers, what would our business be without customers? And last but not least, what about our employees? I would suggest that all of these and more are our neighbors that we are called to love. But what does it look like to love our neighbors? How do we measure this? We live in a Western society that likes to measure and have metrics. I would suggest one way of measuring this is to have a scale from 0 to 5 and rank how are we doing with demonstrating love to our employees, our suppliers, our customers, the government, investors, creditors, and the community. And then you can draw a graph like this. Let me share with you a few stories. This is an example of a charity. This charity is well known for its charitable work. And so it does a great job with many of the neighbors God has entrusted it with, except for its employees. Many of the employees hate working for this employer. They just find it a toxic environment. They just don't enjoy the place. There are a few employees who are being abused in this workplace. So all of a sudden, we have this workplace where it's a score of 5 on almost everything, but it's a score of 2 in the way they deal with their employees. Or what about this employer? This is an example of a church. And they were doing a great job in their community. The staff loved working at this church. They had an amazing relationship with their creditors. They borrowed some money for the building program and were able to pay it off very quickly. Their investors, in this case, the donors, were really impressed with the church. And the customers, and being a church in this case, the people who attended on Sunday mornings, loved the church services. They loved the people there. But why is there not a 5 for government and suppliers? Well, this particular church moved into their building, and the city where they built this church requires you to have an occupancy permit before you're allowed to occupy the building. And the people in the building committee said, you know what? We don't need an occupancy building permit. We know the building's safe. But what message did they send to the people working in the city government? They said to the people working in city government, you don't know anything. You're not important. We know more than you. There was no love being shown to these people working in the city government. Why is this number low for suppliers? Well, several reasons. For a season that this church was for a season of the building program, there were no doors and no windows on the building. And so they had a security guard sitting there. But the church said, you know what? We don't have to do anything for the security guard. That's his job. The construction folk, that's their job to build the building. We don't need to get to know them. We don't need to know their names. We don't need to get to know their stories. Are they demonstrating Christ's love to the suppliers? What does that look like? Or consider another example. This is an example of a corporation that I worked for many years. As employees, we loved working here. It was a great work environment, great support from management. We weren't expected to work long hours. It was a real family environment. This company took care of the small customers. They went out of their way to serve some of the smaller customers. They had a good relationship with the government, with suppliers. They had a great relationship with creditors. But their shares were trading at about $5 a share, when all their competitors' shares were trading at $30 to $40 a share. It just wasn't a profitable company. And being a publicly traded company, one day some activist investors looked at this company and said, share price of $5 a share? We can do better than that. We can bring the share price up to $40 or $50 a share. So they bought shares in the company, and they became the controlling investors on the board of directors of the organization. They brought a new CEO in, and within 3 years, they made a lot of people independently wealthy. The share price went from $5 to $60. It exceeded their expectations. Creditors were still happy. They continued to comply with government regulations. But in the process of bringing the share price from $5 to $60, they said, we're no longer going to serve some of the small rural customers. They can bring their goods to us. They said to their suppliers, they renegotiated all the contracts with the suppliers, driving down the cost of supplies. And for employees, it became a place ruled by fear. We were all afraid that we would lose our job the next day. We wondered where we were in the game of survivor. What number was ours? Would our number be called, and would we be fired tomorrow? It was not a healthy or a happy place to work. And so this gives you some ideas of how a person could measure an organization in the various dimensions of people. But before I leave this topic, I want to ask one more question. Are we spending more time listening to God? Or are we spending more time throwing darts and finding faults with the other people in our organization? Are we taking more time looking at the organization and coming up with metrics and saying, that's not an organization that's loving God. That's an organization that's not being a good steward of God's creation. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. Don't pick on people. Don't jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. That critical spirit is a way of boomeranging. It's easy to see a smudge in your neighbor's face and be oblivious to the ugly sneer on your own. Do you have the nerve to say, let me wash your face for you, when your own face is distorted by contempt? It's this whole traveling roadshow mentality all over again, playing a holier-than-thou part instead of just living your part. Wipe that ugly sneer off your own face, and you might be fit to offer a washcloth to a neighbor. So let me ask you in conclusion, how will you steward your passion, the gift that God has created you with for this particular time? How will you be a good steward of the place where God has placed you for this season? How will you be a good steward of the people God has entrusted to you for this season? Will you choose to walk with God in this place with these people, using the passions God has chosen you to give you? Or will you use your rational mind and say, this is the job I've chosen, this is the company I've chosen, these are the skills I've been born with? Or to ask these questions another way, how will you be a good and faithful steward of the towns God has blessed you with? How will you glorify God and enjoy Him where you work? How will you love your neighbors at work? But what about at university? Is this something that happens during your part-time job and doesn't apply to university? Or is this something that you need to figure out in university while you're still doing your studies? Or is this something that starts in junior high and high school? Or is this a miraculous transformation that happens when you walk across the stage and get your graduation diploma? At that moment, somewhere halfway across the stage, when you're handed your graduation diploma and your picture is taken, do you all of a sudden magically get an infusion from heaven and learn to be a good steward of passions you have? Did you learn to love your neighbors? Did you learn how to glorify God? I'm not sure. So the choice is yours. The question is yours for today. How will you steward your passions? How will you be a good steward of the place where God has placed you? How will you be a good steward of the people God has given you?